Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first Insight Series lecture of this semester. We are pleased to have with us Professor Ram Kumar from TIS Mumbai. He's been my former professor, and I'm glad that he could accept our invitation to come here and deliver a talk on a topic I feel is of great contemporary relevance, because I feel that not many people are actually working on this, but it needs a lot of attention because our country is predominantly an agrarian country, and I feel that the kind of attention it needs, both academic as well as otherwise, is missing from the mainstream discourse. I'll give a brief outline. I'll give a brief outline of the talk, and then I will invite my student to introduce the speaker, following which we will have the talk. The abstract of today's talk goes like this. India has completed close to 3 decades of the implementation of economic liberalization policies. This book, the book upon which this talk is based, is a composite and critical account of Indian agriculture during the period of liberalization. Agriculture was one of the most contentious arenas of policymaking in this period, marked by occasional spurts of growth, coexisting with acute agrarian distress. From the standpoint of political economy, this book discusses and analyzes a range of themes in Indian agriculture, which includes land ownership, tenancy, public investment and expenditure, prices, international trade, crop incomes, profitability, input subsidies in insurance, marketing, and food distribution. A key feature of the book is its simultaneous focus on both a broader macroeconomic outlook and extensive evidence collected through intensive village surveys. The contributions to the book demonstrate that the impact of the policies of liberalization on agriculture was uneven and adverse. Even as the growth of large-scale agrarian capital from below was stemmed by policy, agrarian transformation continued to be characterized by both inequality and differentiation. This book is an essential teaching material and a valuable reference text for students and researchers of Indian agriculture. I now invite my student Anthony to give a brief introduction of the speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Ashish, for that. Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first Insight Series lecture of this semester, hosted by Humanities and Social Sciences Department at IIT Gandhinagar. The Insight Series lectures began in 2022 by Professor Ashish Khaka with a focus on indigenous peoples and development issues. Previous luminaries who have graced the lecture include P. Sainath, Professor Rashid Khalidi, Professor Mahmood Mamdani, and Professor Edgar Gnansunu. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor R. Ramakumar. He is an economist by training and is currently a professor at the School of Development Studies, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. His areas of interest include agricultural economics and development economics with a focus on poverty and inequality. He has earlier held visiting academic positions at the University of Zurich, London School of Economics and Political Science, Queen Mary University of London, Goa University, and the Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. Since September of 2016, he has also served as a non-ministerial member of the Kerala State Planning Board. His 2 recent books, Notebandi and Distress in the Fields, have been acclaimed by reviews as authoritative accounts of demonetization and agriculture in India over the past 3 decades. He also writes extensively in peer-reviewed journals, newspapers, and magazines. On behalf of the Humanities and Social Sciences Department, please join me in welcoming Dr. R. Ramakumar to IIT Gandhinagar.
I would like to present a small memento of appreciation to Dr. Ramkumar for coming to our campus. So,
thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashish. Seeing him after a long time tells me that he has not changed a bit. And all students and faculty of IIT Gandhinagar. I thank you very much for inviting me and also for coming, taking time out to hear me over the next 45 minutes, I suppose. So, which puts me in a little difficult position because he asked me to basically speak about this book, which came out in 2022. I'm happy to do that, but 45 minutes will be a little problematic for that. So what I thought was that I will sort of pick and choose, rather cherry pick a little points from there, but also try to expand upon it in some sense. Expand upon it in the sense that I will sort of update some numbers from the book. I will also speak about what I think are some of the more recent features of agricultural development in India, with some specific reference to the last 1 decade or so. So that's a little more than a decade, from about 2011-12 onwards. So I'll sort of contemporize it a little bit, even though the book is about 3 decades of liberalization and agriculture. So basically, the book is a long history of agricultural development in India in the post-independence period as well. That's why I was worried about 45 minutes. In the book, if you read closely, I have a longish introduction where I try to sort of summarize the history of India's agricultural development across 4 phases, as you can see on the screen. The 4 phases are typically the first 15 years of independence between about 1950 and 1965, covering roughly the 3 first 5-year plans. The first 15 years constitute thus a pre-Green Revolution phase in India's agricultural development. You can then see the second phase, which I call as the early Green Revolution phase, which is about 15 years long, from about the mid-1960s to either the late 1970s or the early 1980s. Then you can see a late Green Revolution phase, which is the decade of the 80s. And then you can have the long period of liberalization, which is the 4th phase, from about 91, 92 to about 2019-20. I'm going to keep it simple because if I bring in COVID, I'll have to complicate the discussion a little bit. I'm going to keep COVID out of the discussion today. I'll come back to it a little later if the need arises. I also try to argue that this 4th phase is not a single secular phase, so as to say that it's a phase where there has been a consistent or steady movement of any variable in one direction. I basically argue that there are 3 sub-phases in this last phase. There is a phase which begins from the early 90s and goes on till the early 2000s. And then there's a phase from the early 2000s till the late 2000s or the early 2010s. And then the last decade, so to say, from about 2011-12. So there are 3 sub-phases here also, which is very important to understand in the discussion. So this is the book that I'm talking about. This book is a lot of friends and colleagues contributed to this book, published by Tulika Books in New Delhi. So let me give you a little flavor of the phasing of agricultural development that I was just talking about. It's a very large table, so I'm going to invite your attention to just this sort of what I have circled in the bottom here, which is for all crops, the growth rates, compound annual growth rates of production in each phase. You can see very clearly that the early Green Revolution phase had a growth rate of about 2.8% per annum in terms of production of all crops, which was actually lower. I think that stop share is actually hiding it. It's about 3.2 in the first 15 years after independence. That was primarily because soon after independence, there was a lot of fallow land in India, which could be brought into cultivation, which gave a very important fillip to agricultural production. But that availability of fallow land came to an end by the mid-1960s, where yield contribution became the only possibility to increase production. That's when we had the Green Revolution, the new seeds, hybrids, and so on. And that increases, that keeps agricultural production at about 2.8%, which is lower than the pre-green revolution phase, primarily because it happened only in rice and wheat, because it happened only in 2 or 3 states, and because it was adopted only by some of the richer farmers in the countryside. So that it was uneven across crops, uneven across regions, uneven across classes of farmers also. So you have you don't see growth rate really picking up in the early green revolution phase. But if you come to the late green revolution phase, 1980s, so to say, you see a very sharp pickup in agricultural production. This is because the technology now spreads into new areas. Technology spreads into new crops, such as oil seeds. Technology particularly spreads into states like West Bengal, which becomes for 2 decades a leader in food grain production in India, as well as potato production in India. All these contribute in some sense to a huge growth rate increase in the 1980s. But if you come to the long period of liberalization from the early 90s to about 2019-20, you see that growth rates actually sharply fall in comparison with the early green revolution phase as well as the late green revolution phase. So to cut the point short, the long period of liberalization from about 1991-92 to about 2019-20 did not see a rise of agricultural production growth rates compared to any previous period. It was actually a lower agricultural growth rate that marked this long 30 years. Some of you may say, yes, it's a very long period. So I'm going to break it down to 3 subphases in the next slide. But before that, let me also take you to the food grain production point, which is the core driver of this growth rates that we are talking about. You can see that it was about 3%, which fell in the early green revolution phase, 2.9, then it comes to about 1.9% only in the last phase. So the last phase, which is the period of liberalization, is actually the period where you have the lowest growth rate of production in terms of food grains in India. This is also the story with yields, but I'm not sort of getting into it to complicate the discussion. This is not obeying me, so I don't know what to do with that. So if somebody can help, I'll be, it's gone up again. Okay. It's you there. Okay. So this is the long period of liberalization that I just spoke about. Let me just break down the period of liberalization to 3 sub-phases, as I spoke about in the first slide. So I'm going to speak about these 3 phases, 90s, 2000s, and then 2010s, 3 decades of liberalization. If you actually look at the same column or same row that I requested you to look at in the last slide, you will see very striking features. The first phase, that is the 90s, you see almost zero agricultural growth in India. The first decade of liberalization, you see agricultural growth rate is about 0.6% only per annum, which is almost close to 0. But come the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, you see a pickup again in growth rates. And that's primarily because globally, the economies pick up. There is a overall rise in agricultural growth rates at the global level, which are transmitted into India as higher domestic agricultural prices, which gives a fillip to production. Public investment goes up in India. Weather conditions are largely favorable. So all these combine together in some form to create this rise of agricultural growth rate to about 3.1% per annum. But then come to the last decade, or the decade between 1112 and 1920, the growth rate dips again to just about 1.8%. And if you actually look at cereals or food grains, you will see this feature reflecting there as well. You will see 0.9, 2.4, and 1.6. So the 3 phases are very clear in the period after liberalization. 2 periods of slowdown and 1 period of rapid growth. The 1 period of rapid growth was between roughly 2003-4 to 2010-11, where a number of favorable features came together. As I said earlier, the prices were favorable, terms of trade were favorable, the agricultural investment increased both in the public and private domains. The weather conditions were favorable for long periods. So all these came together to create a favorable growth rate ecosystem in that time. But then come to 2010 and 2011, the picture turns again, and all the favorable features of the first decade of the 21st century became the unfavorable features of the second decade of the 21st century. And this period is what I shall I shall speak about in some greater detail in the time that I have. But before that, I will also take you to, sorry for this, I'll put it like this. Yes. I'll take you through some of the broad features of these 30 years that we are speaking about. What are the broad features of these 30 years that we are talking about? The first feature is that with the coming of economic liberalization in India, India basically moves into a market regime in agriculture. Now, if you get into a market regime, typically governments begin to look at not institutions, but prices, terms of trade. So prices are largely seen as a variable which creates incentives for investment, growth, etc. in agriculture. So terms of trade began to be seen in this period with the coming of liberalization as the very important variable that would drive agricultural growth. As a result, I'll come to prices a little later, but as a result, what happened was institutional change was not given the importance that it deserves. So a lot of issues related to agrarian relations, a lot of issues related to land distribution, etc., came to be ignored or sidelined in these 30 years that we are talking about. You will see that in different ways. The dilution of the land reform laws was a very important feature of this period. You basically saw land reform laws as an obstacle to land acquisition, as an obstacle to changing the character of agricultural land to non-agricultural land. Who can buy, who can sell land? Earlier, it were only the agriculturists who could purchase land in the villages. Now, in many states, almost anybody could buy land from anywhere in the country. All these changes came about in land reform laws, which essentially was trying to create what economists call a free land market in the Indian countryside. It was assumed that if a free land market becomes a reality, investment will become much more lucrative in agriculture, and more private investment is likely to flow into agriculture and create agricultural investment, agricultural growth, agricultural employment, and so on. So this was the assumption that essentially drove this policy change. The GIFT City that you see very close to your campus is a product of these reforms in land reform laws that you saw in Gujarat from about the 1990s onwards. It's not a product of Mr. Modi's regime. It began much before Modi's regime and continued into Mr. Modi's regime, and that essentially flattened out the land reform laws. Gujarat was actually the pioneer in these reforms that we are talking about, and much of the activities that you see in and around Gandhinagar are actually a result of these reforms. So basically, ease of land acquisition and conversion of farmland, non-farmland, all these became important priorities for governments, both at the national level and at the level of different states. Second is with the signing of the WTO agreement in 1994 and its coming to operation in 1995, you had a free trade regime in agriculture. Not exactly free, but much freer than before regime in trade in agriculture. What this essentially did was two things. One, theoretically, India received market access to other economies of the world or other markets of the world, whereby India could actually export its commodities to the rest of the world and make money, right? But this is something that did not in reality happen because other countries did not open up their markets as promised. This is actually an ongoing issue in the WTO negotiations every year. On the other hand, because India opened up its markets, India became the destination for extraordinary quantums of imports of agricultural commodities, particularly in crops like tea, coffee, rubber, different spices, plantation crops, cotton, oil seeds. All these commodities came to be imported into India in very large quantums. So there was a two-sided change here. One, India could not export as much as it was expected. India became the destination of significant amounts of imports also. What it actually did was that the price advantages that Indian farmers were supposed to get by exporting to other countries was not realized. And the price depressions that were supposed to happen or that were not supposed to happen typically with the rise of imports actually happened. So prices were pulled downwards in a significant way after 1995, which is one of the reasons why you saw the beginning of farmer suicides and so on from 1996-97 onwards, and a period of agrarian crisis, distress, as different people like to call it in different names. That era was inaugurated with this fall of prices, essentially from the mid-1990s onwards. So this is the second important feature of the period that we are talking about. The third important feature of this phase is related to trade, which is that because of this kind of increased integration with the world economy, Indian prices came to be heavily correlated with global prices. So if whatever little change takes place in global agricultural prices earlier were protected, India was sort of immune to those price changes happening globally, which is what is shown by the low correlation coefficients between Indian prices and domestic prices in the earlier periods. But you will see in the four crops, maize, rice, wheat, and sugar, given as illustrations in this table, the correlation coefficients between Indian prices and international prices rises from about 0.1 to about 0.7, 0.8, and so on, near to perfect correlation of 1 in the period that we are talking about, which meant that any fluctuation, volatility in the international market was quickly transmitted or imported into the Indian domestic markets, leading to a downward pull of prices. This gave rise to enormous uncertainties in agriculture. More than price falls, what actually happened was this seriously violated the possibilities of rational decision making on the hands of producers, because there was no certainty of price movements in any way. Any small change in or volatilities in the international market was quickly transmitted to the domestic market. Now, this led to a crash of agricultural prices in the 1990s, which led to a shift of the terms of trade against agriculture, which affected the investment priorities in agriculture. And that's what you see primarily as a lower agricultural growth rate in the time that we are talking about. This was also the time of fiscal austerity on the part of the governments, both center and the state, where expenditures were not increased in agriculture to the extent that they were expected to. This was the era when fiscal deficit becomes a very sacred term in budgetary management. You basically try to keep fiscal deficits low for multiple reasons, primarily to ensure that global finance enters into a country under the assurance that you are a stable country with low fiscal deficit, low debt, and so on, primarily to portray the country or an economy as a secure nation for finance capital. You kept fiscal deficits low, and basically that led to, governments can increase expenditure in only two ways. Either you increase taxes and spend more, or you borrow more and spend more. A third option is cutting expenditures, right? But if you see, tax rates were largely cut during this time. Direct taxes particularly were cut through the 1990s. You also saw borrowings being reduced gradually over this time. Monetization of deficits by the Reserve Bank came to an end in 1997. Borrowings began to decline by 1998-99 onwards. Fiscal deficits were legislated into the fiscal responsibility legislations of the early 2000s, whereby fiscal deficit legally could not rise above 3% of the GDP from the early 2000s onwards. So you basically have no rise in tax revenues, also no possibility of borrowings to finance expenditures. So basically, this was the period of fiscal austerity where budgetary allocations to agriculture, public investment in rural areas, in irrigation, rural roads, rural markets, etc., as well as public investment in agricultural research, extension, and so on, all of them fell as a share of the GDP, right? So this was also a very important change that happened during these 30 years that we are talking about. You also saw, for the same reasons of fiscal austerity, you saw a withdrawal of input subsidies in a big way. I shall show you some numbers in the following slides to illustrate what this actually means. Overall, what this led to is a rise in the costs of production in agriculture. This cost of production in agriculture coincided with a phase where prices on the output side were not actually rising, because you had trade pulling down prices, imports pulling down prices all the time, demand for agricultural commodities not rising as it was expected to happen during the periods of opening up the economy. As a result, basically output prices failed to rise, but input prices continued to rise. This is a simple problem. This is not a This is every household's problem. So it's an economic problem for the nation. So basically, your costs are rising, but incomes are not rising. So you basically have a fall of profitability rates, which is what you summarize as the agrarian distress or agrarian crisis in India. I hear Sainath was here a few months back, and he is likely to have spoken about this in greater detail. And this is what we call, this fall of profitability rates is what essentially we call as agrarian distress in India. And my book essentially explores why this fall of profitability rates happen. What are the triggers for this fall of profitability rates in agriculture? This was also combined with certain other features, reform of agricultural credit and a financial liberalization, where essentially you saw a retreat of public banks from rural areas and a return of the sahukar or the moneylender to the countryside. So basically, if 100 rupees was borrowed by a household, if about 64 rupees was borrowed from public sources, banks, cooperatives, etc., by 30 years, it had fallen down to about 55 or 54 rupees. The rest was actually supplied by moneylenders or landlords in the rural areas. So this rise of informal credit was also a feature of this period that we are talking about. You also have other issues, which I'm not getting into now because it'll get too detailed. There are also threats on reducing procurement. Partial dismantling of the public distribution system happened. Public distribution system, which was universal prior to 1997, became a targeted public distribution system with an APL, BPL division coming in afterwards. Now it's priority and general division. So this is also a feature that came in by the late 1990s. This is what we call as the distress in agriculture. The sum total of all these features that we have mentioned in this slide is what led to this crisis or distress that we are talking about. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of the long story of 30 years before I get into the short story of the last 10 years. So this is what the book essentially has chapters on each of these bullet points in some sense. It has a chapter on fertilizers, it has a chapter on seeds, it has a chapter on research, it has a chapter on investment, it has a chapter on credit, it has a chapter on marketing, it has a chapter on all these features that we just discussed in this slide. So if you actually move on to the last 10 years, I'm going to now come to the last decade or so to sort of amplify what is happening in the countryside today. A lot of people, particularly after the 2024 parliament elections, have begun to take the rural areas more seriously, right? Those who argued before June 2024 that there is absolutely no problem in agriculture, there is absolutely no economic problem in rural areas, have suddenly woken up to the reality of a crisis or a distress in agriculture. And suddenly you have a very important leader of the political party being appointed. Earlier, the agriculture ministers were unknown entities, right? People could not even name the agriculture minister of India. Now there is an important person. The former Madhya Pradesh chief minister has been appointed as the agriculture minister of India. That itself is the sense of urgency that the ruling regime actually feels about the problem at hand. That is because of this particular problem that we have at hand, poor agricultural growth rate. And I'm not going to give you growth rates once again. So I'm going to put it in a different way. This graph is basically showing sectoral deflator in agriculture. Sectoral deflator in agriculture is a ratio, simple ratio. That ratio is, I calculate the growth rate of GDP from agriculture at current prices divided by the growth rate of GDP from agriculture at constant prices. Growth rate at current prices divided by growth rate at constant prices. Now, if this ratio actually rises, it means that current prices are rising rapidly. GDP at current prices are rising rapidly. If this ratio falls, it shows that GDP at current prices relative to constant prices, which is the denominator, is actually not rising at all. It's actually the difference between them is shrinking, which is actually a bad news for agricultural prices because it essentially will show a shift of terms of trade away from agriculture, which means that there are disincentives to invest in agriculture in such a period. So if I take the first period, which is actually the period of the 1990s, the post-WTO period, immediate post-WTO period, you saw a very clear decline in the terms of trade, in the sectoral deflator that I'm talking about, which is what shows up as 0.6% growth rate in my first table. Basically, absolutely no incentive to invest. And then follows the period between 2003 and 2011, where there was a sharp agricultural growth rate. The second period of the liberalization period, where you see this sectoral deflator going up. Right? And then I come to the third phase, the last 10 years, where growth rate declined again. And then I'll see that this number is falling again. So essentially, in the period after 2011-12, agriculture has entered a new phase of crisis. It has come out of the growth rate period of 2003 to 2011. It has entered into a low growth period after 2011, primarily because the sectoral deflator has sharply declined. In fact, there was a quarter in 2019 when sectoral deflator actually became negative. Right? And this essentially means that agricultural prices simply have not risen. If agriculture prices had risen, then the ratio would have agriculture prices are rising, because that's why the number is still positive, right? Because it's a difference between, essentially it is a ratio which shows the current prices in the numerator and constant prices in the denominator. But this falling essentially means that agricultural prices are simply not rising in this period. Now, this is the most important story from my point of view of the last 10 or 12 years of Indian agriculture. You simply don't see agricultural prices rising. This has many reasons, particularly because of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. Global economies went into a period of low growth, if not recession. Global demand for agricultural commodities has fallen, or it's not rising. As a result, global agricultural prices are simply not rising. The global agricultural prices were depressed, and this has been transmitted to Indian agriculture as low prices because we are completely integrated in some sense with the global markets. So this is the reason why you have a clear disincentive to invest in Indian agriculture in the last decade or a little more than a decade. Now, let me get into investment numbers proper. Okay, these numbers essentially show the top one is public plus private investment in agriculture. This one is private investment in agriculture, and the bottom orange one is public investment in agriculture. All is investments as a share of GVA in agriculture, which is a close relative of GDP in agriculture. So if you calculate it, investment is usually given as an investment rate, as a share of the GVA from that sector. And if I see this graph, you will see that this begins from 2011-12. You will see that private investment in agriculture clearly falls from about 16% of agricultural GVA to about 10% of the agricultural GVA. It's a 5 percentage point decline in private investment as a share of agricultural GVA over the period of close to a decade. Right? And then there is a minor increase here. This is because of COVID. Everybody came back to rural areas with COVID. Everybody lost work in urban areas. Millions, according to the Indian Railways, some 2 to 3 crore people returned to villages. What did all of them do in the villages? They picked up whatever little agricultural land they could gather and started cultivating them to ensure food security. This shows as a sharp rise in the number of people working in agriculture. Obviously, this will come up also as an increase in private investment in agriculture, because more people will buy seeds, more people will buy fertilizers, more people will buy agricultural inputs and so on. This will come up as a higher investment in agriculture. So that is why you see this rise. But what is happening to public investment, which is actually the most important feature of any investment phenomenon? In agriculture, all periods of growth in Indian agriculture have coincided with an increase of public investment in agriculture. Because public investment in agriculture is known to be a high multiplier investment in the economy. It is supposed to have the highest impact on reducing poverty, highest impact on increasing agricultural growth by most empirical studies in agricultural economics. But if you look at the public investment, it's been rather flat, right? So in the absence of private investment rising, which is actually falling here, public investment could have or should have risen, but that did not happen. So overall investment, public plus private, also fell. Right? So this is what I meant earlier as a sharp disincentive to invest in agriculture because of the fall of the sectoral deflator in agriculture. Nobody is incentivized to invest in agriculture. It's actually seen as a loss-making phenomenon relative to investing in other sectors. Right? So this is the other important feature of this period that we are talking about. Last 10 to 11, 12 onwards, if you see, investment in agriculture has sharply declined. Now, that's about public investment in roads, markets, infrastructure, and so on. That does not include one important investment the governments must make, which is public investment in agricultural research, public investment in agricultural extension. Again, as a share of GVA in agriculture, you see both of them here. What do you see here? From 2011-12 onwards, you see public investment as a share of GVA in agriculture in research sharply fall. Right? Why is this fall? If you ask any agricultural research station, they will tell you when was the last time they appointed a scientist. Many years back. Because they cannot appoint a scientist and they don't have money for it, agricultural universities and ICAR, agricultural research centers, have found a shortcut, which is to appoint what they call YPs. YPs are young professionals, right? Young professionals means you pay them 50,000 or 45,000 rupees per month and you keep them for temporary contract work. They are supposed to do the work that scientists are supposed to do. So absolutely no investment is flowing into agricultural research. That's true of most agricultural universities in India today. So the global average of this number in the developed world is 2 to 3%. 2 to 3% of the GVA in agriculture is usually invested in agricultural research. The average for developing countries is 0.7. Right? Where is India? 0.5. So our investment in agricultural research, despite all the tom-tomming of Green Revolution achievements and so on, is actually very low, 0.5% of as a share of the GVA in agriculture. Same is the case with agricultural extension, which is very low, right? So this is another feature of the falling investment in agriculture in the last decade or so. Let me go ahead. As a result, what happens? Our agricultural productivity is one of the lowest in the world. Right? These are our actual agricultural productivities for the range of crops that are in the table. You can compare them with both the global average yield and also with the state with the highest yield in India. Right? This is what agricultural scientists call as the yield gap. What we actually achieve compared to what can be achieved. These numbers actually show, and in fact, if you look at the world's highest yield, it really becomes very worse, right? But if you actually look at average yield and average for the state with the highest yield, even then you have a very wide gap out there for a range of crops. In other words, agricultural productivity can actually double in many crops, if not triple in certain other crops. Huge potential exists to increase agricultural productivity, but we have not been able to invest adequately in public agricultural research to make this possible. Now, there is a new phenomenon now, which is called climate change. Now, climate change, as I said, made this more complicated because it's not anymore necessary or it's not anymore sufficient to produce varieties and hybrids with high productivity. We also need varieties with climate resilience, right? That means much more investment is required in agricultural research than we have made in the past. So that is a little added point that I wanted to make here. This, as I said earlier, has coincided with a sharp decline in profitability, which I said is the most important indicator of the distress that we are talking about. Look, I'll give you, I'm not going to give you all subcategories of inputs, but I'll give you the most striking one, which is fertilizers, right? This is the graph which shows from the Commission for Agricultural Prices data. These are surveys of farmers conducted across India, costs per hectare for fertilizers and insecticides in the country. Right? You can look at fertilizers to make it simple. Cost per hectare for fertilizers. You can see they have been rising, but from 2009-10 onwards, look at the huge increase of cost per hectare in fertilizers that has happened. In paddy, this is in wheat, exactly the same period, you see a sharp increase. This is maize. This is cotton. Every crop, I'm just giving you 4 crops for illustration. All crops essentially have seen a huge rise in costs per hectare of fertilizers. And other inputs have also risen. Seed prices have risen. Wages have risen. Costs of diesel, electricity, all that have risen. So there is a general increase in cost of cultivation that has taken place. Now, as I said, this would have been okay if prices were rising at rates faster than these increases. But as I showed in the sectoral deflator graph, prices are not rising as much as they should. So you basically have what the Soviets called in the 1920s as the scissors crisis, right? You have 2 blades for a scissor. You basically have one is input and one is output. Both are moving unfavorably. As a result, you have a scissors crisis. You basically cut it from both ends, and basically you become 2 pieces. That is the story of Preobrazhensky in 1924. But this essentially shows a very similar phenomenon here. Now, as a result, what happened? These are fertilizer prices. Now, global and domestic agricultural prices have been falling, as I mentioned a while back. But this could have been compensated. This could have been compensated if Indian MSPs had risen. MSPs means minimum support prices announced by the government. If they had increased, then a part of this decline of global prices could have been alleviated. Has MSPs risen? If you actually see 3 periods here for 5 crops, paddy, wheat, cotton, soybean, gram, just to give you a flavor of the major crops. 3 periods, 1991 to 2002-3, 2003-4 to 12-13, and 13-14 to 23-24. If I take these 3 periods like this, you will see that in the earlier periods, MSPs were rising at about 8% per year on an average. But in the last 10 years, the government has refused to raise MSPs at the same rates. You basically have MSPs rising by just about 4%, 5%, 6% only. Right? So MSPs are simply not rising as fast as they should to compensate for the input cost. So market prices are rising and MSPs are also rising at a slower rate. And this is the reason why you see a very clear fall in profitability in agriculture. If I show you those numbers, these are profitability ratios for crops, right? All of this is official data. I have not cooked up anything. These are all government numbers which are put out every year. You can see profitability rates for paddy, 2.3. If you invested 1 rupee, you could get back 2 rupees 30 paisa from paddy cultivation in 2007-8 or 8-9. Now it is only about 1.8. Right? If it was 2.9 in wheat in 2007-8, now it's 2.5. It effectively went down to 2.3 during some periods. Maize, similar fall. Cotton, similar fall. Cotton fall has been sharper from 2.9 to 1.4. So all these show if 1 rupee if you invest, how much will you get back? In some sense, it's a profit rate that we are estimating. Now, this is if you take, you see 2 lines. You see two lines in this graph, right? One is on the top and the bottom. I've been referring to the top one. The top one is essentially the gross value of output divided by the paid out costs. Paid out costs are what are called as A2 costs, what the farmer pays from his or her pocket, right? But that does not include imputed costs for land and labor, the opportunity cost of land and labor. If you add the opportunity cost of land and labor, you get what is called as the C2 cost, which is actually higher than A2. So if I actually include C2 as the denominator and not A2 cost, then obviously the profitability rate falls. But what is more striking is that they are almost at 1. And in some cases, they are actually less than 1. Right? If I include the opportunity cost of land and labor, what do you mean by opportunity cost of labor? Family labor used by farmer households in the farm. Essentially, it's unpaid labor by women, if not children also, right? Essentially, it is that labor, unpaid labor of women and children in the household, which is keeping agricultural profitability rates at this level. If you actually paid them wages, then the profitability rates would have been lower than 1, which is what it actually shows. You come less than 1 in many years. In wheat, you don't see that because wheat is not so much a labor-intensive crop. But if you actually go into maize, you see a number of years where it is less than 1. Here also, a number of years which is where it is less than 1. If women and children are paid wages in agriculture, agriculture is a loss-making proposition. Agriculture survives in India because you don't pay wages to women and children working in the families of farmers. That's the second important story from this graph, other than the fall of profitability rates itself. Okay, this essentially means that if you look at data from the government's situation assessment survey of the National Sample Survey Organization, these are nominal incomes of farmers. These are real income from farmers. We don't have a third survey yet, which is supposed to happen in 22-23, but it has not happened yet. If it comes, I'll have more detailed and updated data to tell you. But this basically tells you that if I take just cultivation, these are incomes of agricultural households from different sources like this. Okay. And if I take just cultivation, you will see the real incomes from agriculture have actually fallen between 2012-13 and 18-19 by about 1.4%. Absolute fall of real incomes. You will see incomes falling from 2855 to 2816 if I deflate it for prices. Nominal incomes have risen, no problem, but that's not how economists would like to see it. You actually would like to see the impacts of inflation as well. So real incomes from cultivation have actually fallen in agriculture. Remember, this is the time when the government promised that it would double the incomes of farmers in agriculture, right? So this is a direct contradiction in terms of the results that you get. Another important thing you get is this 57%, which is the rise of wage incomes for agricultural households. In other words, because incomes are low from farming and cultivation, they are increasingly resorting to working in other people's farms for wages. That is why you see a sharp 57% increase in wage incomes for these agricultural households. These are households with land. Right? Despite that, you see a sharp increase in wage incomes. So that is the second important indicator that you get of distress in agriculture. Now, this is also this is the last part of my presentation. I come to employment and wages. This is the part that I want to deal with in some in the little time that I have. First problem when you start discussing employment is data, or rather the absence of data. Right? So there is nothing that has been more controversial in the recent times than the official data on statistics, official statistics on employment. Right? If you remember 2017-18, the government was supposed to release a survey after it discontinued the employment and unemployment survey of 2011-12. The periodic labor force survey was supposed to begin in 2017-18. That report was not published by the government for a long time. And later it turned out, when it actually came out, it was very, very clear why the government did not want to put it out. I'm coming to that in the next slide. But then now it is now available. And when it actually came out in 2017-18, the first argument by many economists was that it is not comparable with 2011-12 numbers. The methodology has changed and so on. But then now they don't anymore make that argument. They now agree that it can be compared. Why did this shift happen? I'll tell you that also in the next slide. This is the story of employment data. Similar is the case with poverty data. If you see, this consumption expenditure surveys have been discontinued. After 2011-12, there was actually an expenditure survey done in 2017-18. That result was not put out. No, the report has not come out. But then now the government is seeking to replace it with what it calls as a multi-dimensional poverty index, which I'm not going to take up in this presentation, but we have a question, we can handle it later, is not a poverty index at all, according to me. So that is the point. Now, coming to the numbers, look at these two columns in this table, which essentially tells you numbers on labor force participation. And this is in rural for male and female. Okay. Now, if you look at these numbers, what it turns out is that if you look at the numbers for labor force participation, the share of the population in the working age that is in the labor force, that is what this number actually shows. Number of people who are employed plus the number of people who are actively looking for work, even if they have not received work. Okay, both are coming under labor force in NSS definitions. So if you look at it closely, the labor force participation rate fell for men from 25 to 18, for women from 40 to 37, it actually fell in rural areas. In other words, the number of people in the labor force as a share of the population shrank, right? This went ahead, but then after 2017-18, the labor force participation began to rise, and it is now back at 55.5 in rural areas. Okay, so this is the story of labor force participation, but you may better understand the next number, which is the unemployment rate in rural areas, right? The share of population that is unemployed. If you look at it, this is the reason why the government was hesitant to put out that report for a long time. The unemployment rate increased from 1.7% in 2011-12 to 5.8% in 2017-18, which was the year immediately following demonetization, right? So this number, the government was not interested to put out, so it did not release the report. Then Business Standard leaked the report, right? And then government had actually no other option but to actually release it. But then it kept on saying for a long time that this number is wrong because it is not comparable with the 2011-12 numbers because of a change in methodology. But that argument is not anymore put out in public. You know why? Because the situation began to turn favorable to the government, as these numbers show, because the unemployment rates began to fall after that to about 2.8% in 2022-23. Now, if you want to take credit for it, you must say that they are comparable, right? So essentially, the argument now is that no. First 2 years were bad surveys. After that, the surveys became better. And there's absolutely no change in the survey design or anything, but just, you need an argument and it's available. So this fall of unemployment rate, so there was this period is a sharp increase of unemployment rate, and then it falls. It's a 2.8 in the last survey of 2022-23, which is still higher than 1.7 of 2011-12 to begin with. But the argument of the government is that there is a sharp fall in unemployment rate despite, and that's the key point, despite COVID, right? Even during the COVID years, when globally unemployment rates rose and labor force participation rates fell, India had a rise of labor force participation and a fall of unemployment. Now, this is the only country in the world which shows such numbers, right? And this has been the site of a number of claims by the government that India has bucked the trend of the world. It is an outlier. It is done remarkably well, and so on. And this is one important claim that the government actually makes. This is male-female numbers, which actually give you a similar result. Now, why? Now, I'm going to just unpack this phenomenon in the next 2 or 3 slides. What explains this so-called improvement in employment? I've put it in quotes, right? The first point is that while the share of workers employed in regular employment and casual employment have fallen. So NSS provides three categories of workers: those who are self-employed, those who are regular salaried workers, and then those who are casual wage workers. All workers are classified into three categories. The share of regular workers, salaried workers, the share of wage workers have not changed at all. But the share of self-employed workers have sharply risen, coinciding with the rise of labor force participation rate and the fall of unemployment rate. Right? Why do I say that? If I look at these numbers, this is for rural plus urban and the share of self-employed in the total workforce. You will see the share of self-employed in rural plus urban has not increased, has increased, total has increased. It is not because of an increase in self-employed men, but because of an increase in self-employed women. Right? So the first point that we get is that the increase of self-employment comes from an increase in self-employment, not among men, but among women. Please save that point, number one. Okay? Because I'll ask you to put it all together in 2 minutes. So the share of self-employment among women has risen, which is what drives the overall rise in self-employment. Number one. So this is rural plus urban. So is it happening in urban or rural? Next question. Okay. So if I look at urban, I'll see that this phenomenon is not so marked as to explain the overall increase. It has risen from about 34% to 40% among women for sure, but it does not explain the kind of increase that you saw in rural plus urban. Right? It had to come from the rural areas, which is where you see 57% to 71% rise in the share of self-employed women. So first is there is an increase in the share of self-employed. Number two, there's an increase in the self-employed share of self-employed women. And number three, where has it happened? It has happened in urban areas slightly, moderately, but it has largely happened in rural areas. So now we have put all three together. The rise in the share of self-employed women in rural areas is what explains this rise of labor force participation rate or fall of unemployment that is tom-tommed. Right? So what is this self-employment of women in rural areas? That's the last question that we have to unpack. Now this is largely because of an associated phenomenon, which is that from about 2019-20 onwards, there has been an increase in the share of workers employed in agriculture and a fall in the share of workers employed in industry. Now, usually when per capita incomes increase in a country, the share of workers employed in agriculture fall, and the share of workers employed in industry, services, etc. rise. But here you have the share of workers employed in agriculture falling. Now, this is differently described as reverse structural change or premature deindustrialization, etc., by several economists who are working in labor studies and so on. Dr. R. Nagaraj calls it premature deindustrialization. Professor Amit Basole of Bangalore calls it reverse structural change. A lot of the characterizations have been offered for this. That is because of this particular phenomenon. The share of women employed in agriculture has risen from about 59% in 2019 to about 69% in 2022. So one last puzzle is also solved. What are the self-employed women doing in rural areas? They are doing something in agriculture. So what explains the rise of labor force participation and the fall of unemployment rate? The rise in the share of self-employed women in rural areas employed in agriculture. Now, what is self-employment in agriculture? Cultivation in own farms. That is largely the main occupation that they are in, which essentially means that probably, that's hypothesis, probably some amount of hired labor has been displaced from agriculture, and that occupation is now being performed by women in the households. And that increased family labor, which has displaced hired labor, is actually being shown up as a higher self-employment among women in agriculture in rural areas. NSS has one more classification beyond this. I'm not showing you a table, just not to complicate the matter. These are largely own account workers. NSS very clearly shows that these people who are increasingly employed in agriculture are unpaid. Unpaid. Right? But because NSS defines employment thus, even if you're unpaid, if you're working, you are in the workforce. Right? So this is what largely explains the fall of unemployment during COVID. It is actually a distress-led movement of people. So everybody who went back to villages picked up a little piece of land and started cultivating it for their own food security, livelihood, because other employments were not coming forth. This distress movement towards agriculture is what essentially shows up as a rise in the share of workers employed in agriculture and a rise in labor force participation in self-employment in rural areas in agriculture among women. So this is the story of rural employment in the last 10 years. Right? Now, this is ILO's India Employment Report, which was released in 2024, a few months back. This will show, I'll invite your attention to this column, additional employment. Additional employment created compared to the previous year. You can see where if 38.6 million people were employed additionally in 2020, 30.8 of them came from agriculture. Right? And if 29.5 million people were employed in 2021, 12 came from agriculture. And if 9.9 came from agriculture, new workers were employed everywhere, 12.9 came from agriculture, because in the rest of categories, there are a few negatives. That is why on the net, you get a lower number in total and higher number for agriculture. Right? Agriculture is employing most people. And that is where most of the unpaid employment is concentrated. That is the point that comes out. Now, this is to be seen with one last point, which is about rural wages. If you look at rural wages have actually fallen in real terms during this period that we are talking about. And if I show you this graph, this is the real wages in rural areas, in all rural occupations, as well as agricultural occupations for men and women. You will see that from 2016-17 onwards, real wages have been flat. There is no increase in real wages. And in the last 2 years, where a lot of changes in unemployment rate, etc., is supposed to have happened, you have a fall of real wage rates in rural areas. Right? So it's very clear. The crowding of agriculture has actually led to a fall of growth rates of wages in agriculture, and real wages have actually fallen. Fall of growth of nominal wages, and as a result, real wages have fallen. This is the story that comes out of agriculture in the last decade. Now, this has to be seen alongside some old problems in India's labor market, which is that a significant section of workers in India, even today, don't get even the minimum wages. Right? You see this. This is all these are shares of workers not getting minimum wages. Okay. So if you look at this proportion under regular workers, casual workers is worse, but regular workers, proportion not getting minimum wage, 73% not getting minimum wage. In agriculture, 27% not getting minimum wage in industry, construction, and total 40%. If I come to casual workers, 76% in agriculture, 36% in construction, and 51.9% among all workers. Half the casual workforce in India don't get minimum wages. And Indian businessmen want hire and fire. Indian businessmen want labor reforms and so on. This is a labor market where even minimum wages are not available for half the casual workforce. Right? That's an old problem. It's not something new, but it's persisted in the recent periods also. One small point I'll make about rural poverty. These are numbers. Finally, one consumption expenditure survey was conducted in 22-23 by the NSS, and that result came out just 2 months back. Some quick analysis have been done by people, but this is what comes out of that. You can see how much poverty exists in India. Right? Whatever we say about the kind of changes in India over the last few years and so on, India remains a dirt poor country. The share of people who spend less than 100 rupees a day is 1/3 of the population. Right? And the share of people who spend less than 200 rupees per day is 33.8 plus 47.3. What is it? 80%. 80% of the people in India spend less than 200 rupees per day. A fair proxy for income, right? So you basically have a situation where 80% of the population, most probably, because consumption expenditure to income is not an easy transformation, but most likely they do not earn more than 200 rupees also. Right? That is the condition of poverty that exists in the Indian economy today. This is their shares in their average monthly per capita consumption expenditure. Okay, this is per day. Right? This is per month, their expenditure per month. You can see the bottom 50% spends 2,621 rupees per month. 2,621 rupees per month. Just sit down, think about that number, and let it sink in. Compare it with your pocket money, compare it with your food price in your canteens, compare it with what happens if you go to a movie, compare it with whatever you want to compare it with. But 2,621 rupees is the monthly per capita consumption expenditure of the bottom 50% of the Indian population. Get that very clear in your head. Right? And if you take the mid 40, the top is spending 25,000 rupees, but the top in this NSS service is actually not the Ambani's or Adani top, right? Their top is like the lower middle class of the Indian population. So that is the situation there. So I'm going to skip this part because I don't have time. Maybe we can do it later. But I would like to sort of conclude the presentation with a little summary like this. You basically have the distress contributed by falling output prices, rising costs of inputs, then rising rural poverty, high rural unemployment, falling rural wages, and so on. Right? But then the reasons are the public investment is not rising, public expenditure is not rising, rural employment is not a focus for policy of any government, and trade protection is off. It must return typically to do anything about this. This is something that I have not dealt with, so I will not get into that. But essentially, the point is that I wanted to give you a summary of what the distress looks like. I wanted to give you a summary of the triggers of the distress in rural areas that we keep talking about in discussions or keep reading in newspapers in some form or the other. Right? I'll stop here, and if there is any question that would be there, I'm happy to take it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ramkumar, for that very extensive analysis and breakdown, I think, of the distress that this country is facing. I mean, the talk was quite sweeping, so I'm sure that it has provoked a lot of questions, and maybe we can take some questions now. We can take some questions after the talk. So if there are any immediate questions, then you can, yeah, someone can maybe help with the mic. Yeah, you can just
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was thinking of one table. You showed one table with nominal income divided by wages.
Yeah.
There, nominal income described was a clearly the one reducing, but in the same table you show the wages are increasing.
The share of wages, share. Yeah.
I was thinking, if income is decreasing, who is paying the wages?
It could be outside agriculture.
Okay, so
They may
that
be, they may be going for construction work. It's not agricultural wages, it's just wages.
okay.
So it could well be non-agricultural wages.
Thank you. I was just a bit confused about that.
Bhaskar and then maybe.
Thank you. It was a beautiful talk. I was asking that when we are talking about the agriculture farmers, the land holdings, I was asking about the land holdings. We are including how much land holding in hectares, or we are including all of the agricultural
Yes.
people, or
Yes, all of them.
Oh.
I mean, in my tables, everybody's nobody's excluded.
all land
Yes,
holdings?
yes.
Okay.
It's an average for all. All numbers are averages for all. You can actually disaggregate it to different size classes of land, which I've not done, but it's possible.
Can we get the slides, or
And sorry?
slides means the PPT, or
All of this is written up in papers and so on. I am happy to circulate it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ramkumar. It was fascinating. First part of the talk, when you showed the drop in the productivity,
Yeah.
the land productivity, I just wanted you to comment on, are there any correlations with regards to increased food processing capabilities that have built up possibly over the past 30 years? That's one point. And second point, unrelated to food processing, is your comment on global regulations with respect to food processing and agri products, stringent regulations, say in the EU or the US, and how that has impacted the lower imports from India. And whether these 2 points are related to the drop in the productivity or not.
No, but in some sense, I can argue that they are not related, but I can also argue that they are related. No, so it's a gray area out there. The reason is that often the growth of agribusiness, exports, etc., is predicated upon higher productivity. Right? Because higher productivity gives rise to the possibilities of larger scale in operations. Right? So if instead of 100 tons coming from a village, 500 tons come from a village. Right? So it's easier to handle. It's more viable to handle that size in logistics or processing and so on. So transaction costs come down per unit area, and then potentialities for processing actually improve as a result. Now so the lower productivity actually increases the transaction costs and actually stymies the possibilities of or potentials of processing and value addition. That is my first answer to that question. The second point that you raised is very important, which is actually a very separate issue. I assume you're referring to different restrictions put by European countries and so on with pesticide residues and so on. Now, I would see that, of course, it is true that EU numbers, EU criteria are very strict and so on. That is true. But there is a larger story to it, which is that EU does not typically wants to typically regulate imports into the EU territory, and it no more has the possibilities of using quantitative restrictions as it used to do in the pre-WTO period. It now can only use tariffs as a mechanism to restrict imports. Now, tariffs have bound tariffs. They cannot be raised infinitely. So what they do is, in lieu of quantitative restrictions, they use these arguments, often cooked up, cooked up in a crude sense, but not exactly cooked up. But they have ways of pooling produce from different importing countries and saying that the pesticide content in a particular consignment is larger than expected, and hence we are banning it for X period of time. So that is actually much like a quantitative restriction in these days. So it's a very, very intelligent use of a quantitative restriction, even though the facility is not available in WTO anymore. I mean, large number of logistics dealers tell me that is the a real explanation for the phenomenon, and not the actual presence of pesticides in those export consignments.
Thank you for the talk. The details were rather disturbing. I have three very short questions. You showed us the sectoral deflator.
Yeah.
If we compare those sectoral deflators with like industry and services, would those be increasing in the same years?
I've not done that exercise, but I can do that and come back to you.
And another thing is you said like fertilizer prices have gone up.
Sorry?
Fertilizer prices have
Yes,
gone up.
yes.
And can you explain why? Because it's
That primarily arose because the government moved into a new subsidy policy from 2009-10 onwards. It was called nutrient-based subsidy regime. Okay. Accordingly, for subsidy for fertilizers was fixed not on X kilograms of urea or X kilograms of DAP or MOP and so on. It became fixed based on the quantity of nutrients that are actually contained inside that fertilizer. Right? As a result, the actual subsidy support for fertilizers and nutrients came down. Right? Government did that to reduce its subsidy bill, but the fertilizer prices went up as a result very sharply. That is why post 2009-10, you see a very sharp increase in the prices of fertilizers.
And a last very small question. You said that the wages increased, not agricultural wages, but like wages in general.
Yeah.
So does that also indicate something about land holding? Does that indicate like small land holdings have disappeared into like large land holdings?
It is not related to that, but I mean, it is certainly true that land holdings are slowly becoming larger in specific regions. That is true. But the wage point is actually what are you referring to? Rise of wages? My last slide?
No, not the last slide. There was a slide about, I don't remember which, but I think it was the slide he was referring to.
This one.
No, before.
This is the only wage slide that I showed.
No, it was a table. It was not
Huh?
a graph. It was a table.
A statement. Okay, understood. But see, okay, these are real wages. When I made that statement, I was talking about nominal wages, right? Uncorrected for inflation. So farmers actually pay the nominal wages, no, but the laborers actually get real wages, right? So when I look at it from the farmer side, I will look at nominal wages. And when I look at it from the laborer side, I will look at real wages. Because real wages are what matters to the worker. So that's the difference between them.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we've overshot our time. So what I'll request you is that maybe we can just assemble here for a quick group picture and then we can depart. We can continue the conversations outside. So I will request all of you to kindly come over here. Thank you.